The FNAF Survival Logbook has been largely ignored for quite a while, as we've seemingly squeezed all the lore tidbits out of it, aside from the tally marks and Foxy Grid, which no one's managed to convincingly solve. To a lot of people, it's just seen as useless and irrelevant by now, after nearly 6 years. I, however, as a self-proclaimed logbook expert who has pored over this book and its secrets for dozens of hours over the years, will not stand for logbook slander. This book is still relevant and still important, and I'm going to prove it to you. It might even change your mind on some things about FNAF 3 that nearly everyone has believed for over half a decade. Mainly, I'm going to be talking about how the logbook affects the timeline, and it has some strange implications. But first, what even is the logbook? In the nearly 6 years of this book's existence, people have still not agreed on what exactly the logbook is even supposed to be. At face value, it appears to be exactly what it says, a legitimate security logbook for a night guard at Freddy's first week on the job. Considering that Mike owns the logbook, obviously Michael Afton, it makes sense that he filled it out during his 1 week as a security guard in FNAF 1. But the more you look into the book, the more problems with this emerge. First, you'll notice Michael's references to sister location. He draws the cash basket and exotic butters from Night 5, and he makes a comment about The Immortal and the Restless, the show he watches between nights. This means Michael is filling this out after sister location. But it wasn't until after FNAF 1 that William destroyed the classic animatronics and took their remnant in the Follow Me minigames, which he then injected into the Fun Times via the Scooper. Which means sister location also has to be after FNAF 1, which makes Michael filling it out in FNAF 1 impossible. There's also the most obvious problem on the logbook's Night 2 through 5 title pages, and the comic of Freddy and Foxy. Instead of showing the FNAF 1 security office, they show the Fazbear's Fright office from FNAF 3. Considering that Fazbear's Fright wasn't constructed until decades after FNAF 1, this shouldn't be possible. Some people have suggested that the Fazbear's Fright office was just created to replicate the one illustrated in the logbook. But in addition to this being quite a stretch, the cardboard box of haphazardly stored toy animatronic scraps in the logbook is clearly the exact same box as the one in the FNAF 3 office. That really only makes sense if the Fazbear's Fright office came first and the drawings are based off of that, not the other way around. There's also a few illustrations in the logbook that point to it being created around present day. On one page, Chica is typing on a laptop that resembles a MacBook, but the first MacBook didn't come out until 2006. There are also 2 pages of the animatronics taking selfies, yet cell phones with a built-in camera didn't exist until the year 2000. There's also the dreaded dabbing Chica, but dabbing wasn't a trend until the mid-2010s. Yes, your eyes and ears aren't deceiving you, I'm unironically using dabbing Chica as evidence. Placing these references in something that was supposedly created all the way back in 1993 doesn't make much sense. Even more, there are multiple references in the logbook to the FNAF 3 minigame Happiest Day. On one page, the book tells you to reflect on the happiest day of your life, and on that very page, there's an illustration of the puppet giving cake to a child. There's also a coupon in the book titled Happiest Day, which is for a reserved party room, a 3-tiered birthday cake, a gift from the puppet, and a custom party kit with invitations and hats. We know that the Happiest Day minigame must happen during either FNAF 3 or, more likely, Pizzeria Simulator, and it makes the most sense that these references to Happiest Day should occur around the time the minigame actually takes place rather than decades before. So, though at first glance it may seem that this is a legitimate security logbook created by Fazbear Entertainment in the 90s, the evidence overwhelmingly indicates otherwise. What is it then? The most likely explanation seems to be that the Survival Logbook was created by the Fazbear's Fright team as an activity booklet for people to buy at the attraction. It presents itself as a logbook for a Freddy security guard because Fazbear's Fright is attempting to make the attraction like an actual Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. It's a fun piece of merchandise for people to pretend to be a security guard. That's also why it has all the fun activities inside that you wouldn't expect from a professional security logbook. The final thing that supports all this is the sticky note after the quiz on spring-lock suits, telling you, disregard this quiz. In fact, don't mention the spring-lock suits to anyone. It's a pretty strange detail. No matter what, the logbook had to have been created at least after FNAF 2 because of the appearance of Mangle in it, and the FNAF 3 tapes implied that the safe rooms were all sealed and their existence covered up shortly after the MCI, which is before FNAF 2. So why would Fazbear Entertainment have made a security logbook mentioning the safe rooms in the first place after they were trying to cover up the existence of them? What's more interesting is that, whereas Freddy's was most concerned about the safe rooms not being brought to light, the sticky note focuses on the spring lock suits. Why? Well, if the logbook is from Fazbear's Fright, the explanation is rather obvious. See, when FNAF 3 came out, people wondered incredulously how the creators of Fazbear's Fright didn't realize that Springtrap had a human corpse inside. Actually, this sticky note shows that they definitely knew about it. Since Springtrap was a late addition, they likely would have already had the logbooks printed with the Springlock section in there. Since Fazbear's Fright is separate from Fazbear Entertainment, they had no reason to keep the Springlock suits a secret. At least at first. When they found Springtrap, they thought they had scored by finding a working animatronic, but they quickly realized exactly what had happened to him. So they slapped a note in all the logbooks for you to ignore the section about Springlock suits. They didn't want anyone to discover the truth about Springtrap, or that could land them in a lot of trouble. But of course, they still wanted to sell the logbooks. So, now that we've pretty confidently placed the logbook in FNAF 3, we can get into the two biggest reveals of the logbook. The first is that Michael Afton is almost definitely the night guard in FNAF 3. Michael Afton is very clearly the one who filled out the book before us, which means that he had to at least stop by Fazbear's Fright and get his hands on one of the logbooks. And at that point, if you're going to say that Michael was at Fazbear's Fright during FNAF 3, it'd be pretty silly for him to not be the night guard. The attraction also never even opened to the public, so he'd probably have to be working for the attraction to obtain one. There was the auction after the fire where surviving items were sold, and some might argue that Michael got the logbook from there. But this ignores the sticky note at the front of the book saying, "Sorry, looks like someone's already written in this one." You don't mind, right? This means that someone else had their hands on the logbook after Michael filled it out. Probably a Fazbear's Fright employee because of the other note and the fact that they're evidently trying to reuse this book to give to another person. There's also the illustrations throughout the book showcasing Foxy as the night guard of the Fazbear's Fright office. Michael is, of course, associated with Foxy in FNAF 4. But if that's not a strong enough association, the Night 1 page shows Foxy reading a Screws, Bolts, and Hairpin magazine, which is a somewhat obscure reference to Hand Unit's dialogue in Sister Location.
Whether you were approached at a job fair, read our ad in Screws, Bolts, and Hairpins, or if this is the result of a dare, we welcome you.
These seem to be meta clues pointing to Michael being the FNAF 3 guard. One currently popular contender for the FNAF 3 guard is Hudson from the Fazbear Fright's story What We Found, in which he works as the security guard for Fazbear's Fright. Yes, the names are confusingly similar. Hudson even has hallucinations induced by Springtrap. It's so similar to FNAF 3 that the Ultimate Guide says, "Is Hudson the night guard from FNAF 3? In general, the events of the story seem to follow the events of FNAF 3 almost to the letter, right down to the ending." Unfortunately, like some other parts of the Ultimate Guide, this is straight up misinformation. What We Found has impossible to ignore contradictions and has an entirely different ending. Most obviously, Hudson only works for one night, whereas the FNAF 3 guard worked at least 7. And instead of the entire attraction burning down, Hudson just gets trapped in an oven and burns to death, leaving the rest of the attraction untouched. So, it is most certainly not canon to the games. And if the FNAF 3 guard is an alternate universe Hudson, that's essentially the same as it just being a random person. Some people think it could be Henry, but there's really no evidence for that. I suppose I should address the final Sister Location custom night cutscene, which is the primary objection to Michael being the FNAF 3 guard. In it, Michael gives a monologue to his father as the rubble of Fazbear's Fright is shown. At the end, he declares,
"I'm going to come find you. I'm going to come find you."
And then Springtrap, technically Dark Springtrap, appears. The presentation of this cutscene is pretty strange, as it's probably not meant to be interpreted literally. Michael Afton is probably not telepathically speaking to William, and probably not saying this at the very moment William emerges from the rubble. I think this cutscene was trying to accomplish two things, among others, that ended up in a messy presentation. I think Scott wanted to indicate that Michael went looking for Springtrap after Sister Location, which led him to Fazbear's Fright, but he also wanted to show Springtrap emerging from Fazbear's Fright's wreckage to tease FNAF 6. I think the cutscene is supposed to be showing the aftermath of Michael finding William. But the cutscene's presentation is a bit messy and unclear, which is what caused Mike Trap to be a thing in the first place, combined with the earlier 8-bit cutscenes. The rest of the evidence, however, is very heavily in favor of the FNAF 3 player being Michael. This second half of the video is my main motivation for making this video because it uncovers something pretty important in the logbook that's been buried. It's also another strong point for Michael filling out the logbook during FNAF 3 in case I still haven't convinced you. So there's a code, for lack of a better word, in the logbook that you've probably never heard of. It's something that, to my knowledge, has been almost entirely ignored. I, however, will not stand for real value code erasure. What's the real value code? Well, on page 79, there's a $16 coupon in which Mike writes, "For real value, see page 61. Page 61 is the comic strip with Freddy and Foxy, which has the whiteboard with the numbers 5 + 4 and 3. If this sounds familiar, it's because this was used in the Cassidy code. Though mistakenly not put in the first printing, the words "my name" appear on page 79, and when redirected to page 61, the numbers 5 + 4, or 9, and 3 give the coordinates for the I in Cassidy. But people all ignore why Michael told us to go to page 61 in the first place. It wasn't to find the 5th letter for the Cassidy code, although Cassidy did use what he had already written for her own purpose. He says to go to page 61 for real value. Real value is an actual term for the value of something adjusted for inflation. For example, an item that was worth $20 in 1987 would be worth about $54 today, so its real value is $54. So what Michael is saying is to go to page 61 to find the value of the coupon adjusted for inflation at the time he's writing this. The coupon has a value of $16. On page 61, if we add the 5 + 4, we get 9 and then 3. Multiplication is the only operation that makes sense, so we multiply the numbers to get 27. So the real value of the $16 coupon at the time Michael's writing this is $27. But when is the coupon supposed to have been from? Our best guess is that it's supposed to be from the last year the last Freddy's was open, so 1993. It could technically be some year before 1993, but I'll address that in a minute. I've used multiple inflation calculators online, and by putting the year as 1993 and the value as $16, the only year in which the real value comes to $27 is 2017. 2016 undershoots it and 2018 overshoots, but 2017 is right on the money. So Michael is definitely not filling this out during FNAF 1. But wait, 2017 can't be right. FNAF 3 takes place in 2023, right? We've known this since it came out 8 years ago, right? Right? Well, my theory for a long time now has been that FNAF 3 doesn't take place in 2023, but instead 2017, or very possibly 2015. I know this contradicts a years-long consensus, but let me explain myself. The real value code is a legitimate code in the logbook. I've seen some people dismiss it because, oh, we already used that page for the Cassidy code, like it couldn't be used for multiple things. But that take completely ignores the fact that even though those pages were used for another code, Michael still tells us to look at page 62 to find the real value of the $16 coupon. This code is intended to show us the year Michael filled out this book. I don't think that should be disputed. That year then also has to be the year FNAF 3 takes place. The only other quote-unquote argument I've seen against this is a hand wave and dismissal. Oh gosh, not that. You can't be serious. And then ignoring it. So let's start with at least acknowledging the fact that this exists and is a thing. Next is to realize that even if I'm solving the code all wrong with the multiplication or the coupon zero or whatever else, it is literally impossible for the logbook to give a year any later than 2017. Why? Because the logbook was released in late December 2017, and the code relies on knowing the inflation rate. It's not possible for the answer to somehow come out to be 2023, because neither Scott nor the designer of the book could possibly know the inflation rates of 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, so that some fan could finally solve it 6 years later after it came out. 2017 is the very latest it could be, and even that might be pushing it because of how long the process of publication can take. Why the year 2017 though? After all, FNAF 3's description says that the game takes place, quote, 30 years after Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors. There are 3 closing of Freddy's pizzerias that we know of. In 1985, when all locations shut down following the MCI, in 1983 with the FNAF 2 location, and then in 1993 with the FNAF 1 location. 2017 does check out as still being 30 years after, quote, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors, it being 30 years after FNAF 2, but wouldn't it make the most sense for it to be referring to the last and final closing of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza? Yes, it absolutely would make more sense. I'm not denying that. Despite that, I still don't think it's talking about the FNAF 1 location closing. Why would Scott make the 30 years in reference to the FNAF 2 locations closing? The only reason I can think of is that, at the time, this was the only Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closing that had a definitive date attached to it, and the most recent one in terms of game release. And we actually see the FNAF 2 location shut down at the end of the game, unlike in FNAF 1, where it's only stated that the pizzeria will shut down by the end of the year, and only in an Easter egg news clipping. It might have just been the closing on the forefront of Scott's mind. In fact, around the time of FNAF 3, I remember seeing many more people call 2017 the year of FNAF 3 than 2023. I don't think it's that big of a stretch. But there's also a chance that FNAF 3 is yet a different year, 2015. The real value code only gives the year 2017 if you place the coupon in 1993, the theorized year of FNAF 1. But FNAF 1 might actually take place in 1992 instead. I know this is a lot of timeline shifting I'm proposing, but stick with me. 1993 has been generally agreed upon as the year of FNAF 1 ever since MatPat made his first FNAF 1 theory 9 years ago, where he matched up Mike's hourly wage to the minimum wage of that time. However, the specific year 1983 was reached under the assumption that the first day of work was a Monday, and that Mike's first paycheck was a Friday, which is a pretty reasonable assumption. Future me cutting in. I checked the video again, and it turns out he doesn't actually use the days of the week. MatPat only lands on the year 1993 specifically because that was the year of the actual real-life murders that he was comparing the game to, which, yeah. Anyway, but in FNAF 2, which has a definitive year, the first workday is a Sunday, and Mike's first paycheck is on a Thursday. If we assume that it was the same for FNAF 1, that puts the game 1 year back in 1992. Some people, though, might point to one of the scrapped Faz facts from FNAF AR, which said, Fazbear's Twisted Pizza recipe was voted most yummy by 6 out of 10 children in every survey from 1988 to 1993. However, there are a couple things to note about this. Unlike the scrapped emails, which were all intended to be used until they were abruptly cut off, the Faz facts are entirely separate from these, and there's no indication in the final product of the game that these were ever going to be used. In fact, there was actually an Illumix stream a while back, which was unfortunately not archived, but a couple people who attended the livestream have claimed that the Illumix employees said that the Faz facts were created without input from Scott. Also, Technical FNAF, a pretty respectable Twitter account that showcases cut content and other technical aspects of the games, recently tweeted that an Illumix employee confirmed exactly this, adding that they should not be used for lore at all. This was apparently an actual employee they spoke to, and not an anonymous DM or anything. So, ignoring the scrapped Faz fact, there's nothing against FNAF 1 taking place in 1992. And the value of $16 in 1992 comes out to be $27 in the year 2015. Which happens to be exactly 30 years after the MCI and the subsequent closing of all Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations. This works a bit better than 2017 because this would have been the big closing everyone in universe would remember. In 1985, Freddy's was in its heyday with multiple locations, when it all suddenly shut down due to the missing children, which certainly got lots of news coverage. On the other hand, the FNAF 1 pizzeria's popularity simply fizzled out until they were forced to close after struggling to bring in customers. But whether or not FNAF 3 takes place in 2015 or 2017, what's most important is that it's not 2023 like everyone has believed. But why is this so important? Sure, it's kind of interesting, but it doesn't seem like something that would affect the lore that much. Well, there's been a lot of debate recently over the timeline of the Pizzaplex saga after we learned from Tales from the Pizzaplex that the timeline is actually a lot tighter than we initially thought. People have gone from suggesting that security breach happened in the 2040s or 50s or even later to the most popular years now being 2029 to 2030, with the Pizzaplex opening in 2024. Yes, just 1 year after FNAF 3 supposedly takes place. There are two connected Tales stories that shifted the entire discussion around the current story's timeline: the Storyteller and the Mimic. I'm not going to give in-depth summaries of them, or this would take forever. There are other places you can go for that. Instead, I'm just going to be talking about the info that's relevant to dates. And it's very confusing. This next section is gonna include a lot of numbers, which I apologize for. Don't worry though, I've made some incredible diagrams to make it more digestible. In The Mimic, Edwin is an engineer who started his own company in, quote, the early 70s, 5 years before the story takes place. 1.5 years before the story, he sold his company to Fazbear Enterprises and has been an engineer for them working on animatronics. Let's pause for a moment and do the math. The latest year that could be considered the early 70s is 1974, so let's say that's the year Edwin created his company. It's been 5 years since then, so the story would take place in 1979. He started working for Fazbear Enterprises 1.5 years ago, which would be 1977, since the story starts in March. We already have a problem. Edwin is working on Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy animatronics in 1979, at the latest. But Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria didn't open until 1983, 4 years later. It's worth mentioning, though, that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is never mentioned in the story, only Fazbear Enterprises and Fazbear Entertainment, and we don't have a confirmed year for when those were created. Also in Ruin, during the Mimic chase, there's a Freddy cutout with the file name 70s Freddy, meaning that at least the character Freddy was around in the 70s. Still though, it doesn't make a ton of sense for the first Freddy's cast to have animatronics years before the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. You'll see a lot of people instead place the Mimic in 1984, since like I said, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria was established in 1983, and some people think the Mimic witnessed the MCI in 1985. They come to this conclusion by essentially just ignoring the early 70s line as a mistake, but I don't think that it necessarily is. The Storyteller is what makes this all important. Though we don't know for certain what year of the Pizzaplex's existence this story takes place in, most people have it taking place during its first year to make any sort of timeline work. In this story, Edwin is 64 years old, so we should just be able to subtract Edwin's age in the Mimic from this to get the time gap between the two stories. Except, it's not totally clear how old Edwin is in the Mimic. The Mimic, the story, not the character, says, for nearly all 24 years of Edwin's life, he loved building things. But it says this in a scene that goes back and forth between the present and reminiscing on the past, and it really isn't clear if this is part of a flashback or not. At least, not from the scene itself it isn't. The Storyteller says that Edwin was 24 when his life was full of promise before his wife Fiona had died. But in the Mimic, Fiona had died 4 years ago, meaning Edwin should be 28 in the Mimic. Also, Edwin being 24 in the Mimic would mean that he graduated college at 19, which isn't likely. Which means the 24 years line in the Mimic was indeed part of a flashback. So let's do the math. If Edwin is 28 in the Mimic, and the year is 1979, then in the Storyteller, when Edwin is 64, the year should be 2015. Huh. Well, that can't be right. That doesn't work even with my new proposed timeline, and definitely not the popular timeline. Let's break this down then. How do other people explain this huge discrepancy? As I said, most people placed the Mimic in 1984, contradicting the early 70s line about when Edwin created his company. This would put the Storyteller in 2020, which is 3 years before 2023, their proposed year of FNAF 3. Needless to say, that definitely does not work. To make it work, people then claim that Edwin was actually 24 in the Mimic, and by doing so contradict what the Storyteller said about Fiona still being alive when Edwin was 24. The other option is to say that either the early 70s was supposed to be the early 80s and was a mistake, or that Scott was just a decade off when calculating ages and dates. No matter what, there's a timeline problem with the Mimic and the Storyteller, because even if FNAF 3 takes place in 2015, there's no way the Pizzaplex opened the same year. On the other hand, putting FNAF 3 in 2015, or 2017, gets us a lot closer to what these two stories give us than putting it in 2023. If the only mistake was that there was supposed to be 40 years between the Mimic and the Storyteller, then that puts the Pizzaplex opening in 2019 at the latest, which gives 2 to 4 years between FNAF 3 and the Pizzaplex opening, depending on whether FNAF 3 is in 2015 or 2017. If that time span still seems too short, keep in mind that the most popular timeline, even after ignoring all the details that contradict it, puts only 1 to 2 years between FNAF 3 and the Pizzaplex's opening. So this is still a better timeline. Ironically, if I'm right, all of this would place Security Breach around the year 2023 instead of FNAF 3, which actually fits with the Happiest Day Easter egg in the Security Breach party room, which seems to be marking 40 years since the bite victim's birthday in 1983. I made a Reddit post a while back that explains the Easter egg in more detail, which you can either pause now to read or find the link for in the description. Lastly, there is one other hiccup, however, and there's a good chance you've been waiting for me to bring this up. There's still Pizzeria Simulator, which people place in 2023 because of the HRY 223 recording, and this theory would require that it not be in 2023. Because if FNAF 3 is 2015, but Pizza Sim is still 2023, that doesn't really help that much, does it? Really though, I've never been totally convinced that 223 is supposed to mean 2023, because that's just not how you abbreviate a year. You don't leave out a digit in the middle. If the number means anything, it would make more sense for it to be a date, 2/23, February 23rd. Or, maybe not. Maybe Pizza Sim is still 2023, and the Tales from the Pizzaplex timeline makes no sense, and maybe FNAF 3 being in 2015 or 2017 is just a cool fact with no significance. That would kinda suck. Which is why I'm going to stick with Pizza Sim happening shortly after FNAF 3, and not in 2023. I want to give an honorable mention to another theory that explains the logbook in a different way. It's called MetaLogbook. Basically, the theory is that the logbook isn't strictly canon. It doesn't have a place in the timeline and isn't meant to be interpreted literally. It's just a cobbled together activity book that contains meta clues to help theorists solve the lore. In other words, people find the logbook too hard to explain, so they decide that it actually doesn't need explaining at all, despite the fact that it's perfectly possible to come up with an explanation for the logbook that perfectly fits with the games. It's pretty much the ultimate cop-out theory, a way for theorists to have their cake and eat it too. They want to take the lore hints they like, but don't want to deal with all the other implications of the logbook they don't like. So they don't have to shift their understanding of FNAF 3. Michael drawing Nightmare Fredbear? Yeah, that means he's the FNAF 4 player. Michael evidently getting this book from Fazbear's Fright? Well, that's clearly just a non-canon quirk of the logbook. The Cassidy code telling us the name of Golden Freddy? Of course, it's a clear lore hint. The real value hint that Michael writes, however? Okay, I actually have no idea how MetaLogbookers explain the real value thing. In fact, the real value code pretty much single-handedly disproves this theory because it's an intentional lore hint no matter what, which means the year that Michael fills out the logbook is important. And that can't be important without it being canon that Michael actually does fill out the logbook. The only reason for the real value code to exist is to give a time reference for the logbook, and that's useless unless the logbook actually fits into the timeline and the contents of the book matter. So no, this theory does not hold up to scrutiny. Right before I end this though, I was just reminded of one more thing. In the FNAF AR emails, Vanessa's username is Nessie97. Often, 2 numbers at the end of someone's username represents the year they were born. Some people think the 97 could stand for 9/7, as in September 7th, but that's mainly because Vanessa being born in 1997 doesn't work for their timelines. The scrapped emails say that Vanessa is 23 at the time, which would put FNAF AR in the year 2020. But this actually works out perfectly fine if FNAF 3 and Pizza Sim occur earlier in the timeline. Just something I wanted to mention. And that wraps up my big theory. Feel free to offer criticism in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see more theory videos like this.